welcome to another Thursdays with ThirdPath live podcast. On every episode, you will meet thought leaders, role models, and change agents connected to the ThirdPath community. And all season long, we are exploring how you can become a work care champion for yourself, for your family, for your aging loved ones. Hi, I'm Jessica DeGroot. And if you're inspired by what you're hearing about today, please share our podcast with someone you know so we can keep on growing this amazing community of work care champions. Now, let me tell you a little bit about who our special guests are today and a quick big picture look at what we'll be discussing. So I'm really pleased to have two amazing thought leaders around the topics of today's discussion. We have Frank Dobbin. He's the chair of the Department of Sociology at Harvard University. He's the author of Getting to Diversity, and he's the parent of 3 young adults. We always talk about how people have work and care responsibilities for our amazing thought leaders because they are modeling what we're thinking about. We're also excited to have Beth Livingston join us. She's a professor of the Department of Management and Entrepreneurship at Tippie College of Business, University of Iowa. She's the author of Shared Sisterhood, and she too is the parent of 2 school-age children. All right, I'm going to show you a couple of big picture thoughts around today's discussion. All right, so we're talking today about the link between flexibility and diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And I was really excited when someone sent me the HBR article that Frank is co-author of called The Surprising Benefits of Work-Life Support. And this is one of the issues he talks about in his book, Getting to Diversity. There's many other things he talks about, but I'm going to zero in on this one and 4 other topics today with Frank. His whole point is that we can change the core career systems in organizations to really promote diversity, equity, inclusion, and because of these changes, make sure we have more managers of color and women managers as well. And so clearly, work-life support is a critical ingredient. But he also has some other great ideas that we'll talk about today: democratizing recruitment, opening up networks, and democratizing training, and baking in systems of change. So you'll be hearing some really smart ideas about how organizations can really promote greater diversity. And this is very relevant today because we believe the workplace is forever changed. We see some emerging organizational forms, some going back to the old ways of long-hour work and on-site work, but a large number of organizations that are normalizing high-performing hybrid workplaces. And obviously, hybrid workplaces are a great example of flexibility that supports the issues that Frank's talking about. We even see some, like ThirdPath Institute, that are normalizing shorter work weeks. This too will help around the issues that we'll be discussing today. And as Frank said, this isn't just about, making it better for leaders, but leaders are critical to the change process. He points out, as long as there are better jobs and worse jobs, positions that carry authority and those that don't, positions that offer a living wage and job security and others that don't, justice demands that those in better jobs reflect the makeup of the country as a whole. And we believe that at ThirdPath too. We think changing leadership is key to leveraging long-term change. But that's not all. After we hear from Frank, I'm really excited to have Beth join us. She's got this amazing book, Shared Sisterhood, that's out. When I talked to her, I realized, oh my goodness, she's a kindred spirit because she too has been working hard in this area and making change. And what we talked about is that if we really want to make change, there's something else that's required because it seems so slow to make change sometimes. So we talked about how if you really want to make change, you need to have change agents become skilled around vulnerability, trust, empathy, and risk-taking. And that was so familiar to us at ThirdPath because we've seen that in our change agents as well. All right, so let's get this podcast started and hear from our guests. Hi, Frank. I'm so glad you're here. As you can hear in my enthusiasm of this introduction, You've done some amazing work. You've captured it in that wonderful article and book. And I really feel like it was familiar to me, because what you're talking about is changing the systems of organizations, in this case, changing the career systems, so that we can really promote all people to move ahead, who are interested in moving ahead in their jobs. Why is flexibility such a relevant and important part of changing career systems? Why is that so important to making flexibility and diversity, equity, inclusion go hand in hand?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here with you, Jessica. Thanks so much for having me. The way the world of work operates in most organizations is that there are some people who have access to flexibility. They tend to be people at the top, or people who those at the top rely directly on. So the CEO, she often has whatever flexibility she needs. She has whatever parental leave she needs. The board lets her do what she wants as long as they think she's performing well. And the people who work directly for her often have the kinds of flexibility they need. They get time off when they have ill parents. They can come in late if they have a small child who's sick. But many people in the organization, often the people who most need this kind of flexibility, who need childcare assistance, who need leaves, family and medical leaves, who need hourly flexibility, often the people who need these things most don't have access to them. So I think one way to think about this is these are benefits that are not offered democratically to everybody. And we know that many people's careers are interrupted by work-life challenges that just become too difficult in their current jobs, so they switch jobs. Often low-wage workers will switch jobs fairly frequently. This is not good for them because it interrupts their career progression. It prevents them from getting the kind of months and years of experience they need to move into supervisory positions. It's not good for their employers, for that matter, because their employers see high turnover. So I think it's a win-win for employers to try to figure out ways to democratize flexibility. And what we see in our research, we see very dramatic effects on the composition of the workforce. So if we look at supervisors and managers, almost any effort to promote flexibility, childcare assistance, and time off, family and medical leave sort of time off, helps women and people of color to persist in their jobs and to move into management. We see strong positive effects, not only for the expected groups, where everybody's expecting white women, who are the people who often champion these kinds of programs. Everyone expects them to do well. So do Black women, Latinx women, Asian American women, but so do groups of minority men, because they're in dual career households most typically, where both people have to keep working full time. And without flexibility, they are also turning over rapidly in their jobs, quitting a job for a while. And it's persistence in the job that's the best predictor, especially for frontline workers, best predictor of moving up in an organization. So I just see this kind of flexibility as something that organizations, it's stupid of them not to do, and everybody benefits.
Yeah. I mean, it was really, and the data you show in your book and in that article is just quite stunning of how big an impact it has. But you go on to talk about there's many places where this kind of intentionality of democratizing some systems can really have a big impact. I mean, it was really interesting, even with recruitment. You were talking about some interesting ideas about how you can, start from the very beginning of the career process to bring more people in who are that inclusive organization that you're reaching for. Managers connecting with groups that on a personal way, so that when someone comes into the organization, they are already feeling connected to the organization. And you talked about, opening up networks so that people could, instead of it just being some people having access to ways to move ahead in the organization, broader networks could get connected into those career systems. Tell us a little bit more about what you've learned across the board around these different career systems that could change.
Well, the beginning of the career system is in the recruitment process, and most organizations are just not aware that they haven't democratized their recruitment processes, because most organizations recruit through, if they're big, formal programs, if they're small, informal programs, going to typically the alma maters of existing managers. And what that usually means is going to historically white colleges and universities, where organizations are not going to find a lot of people of color. So one thing we see is organizations that just expand their regular recruitment systems to go to historically Black colleges and to go to Latinx serving colleges and universities. They see dramatic increases in the diversity of their managers after a couple of years. And that connects to opening networks up, because if you send your own managers on these visits, instead of just using third-party recruiters, what you'll quickly see is your managers are making connections with the faculty in these institutions, with the career services group in these institutions, and with younger students who aren't yet ready to go on the job market. And those connections create long-term networks that help the firm to recruit people over time. Yeah. Another thing that really helps with the recruitment is when firms put in referral incentive programs. Because referral incentive programs, what they do in effect is they tell people who are in frontline positions that we want you to refer your friends and family. CEOs and CFOs, comptrollers, these people already know they can refer their friends and family, but they tend to be white men. If you want to get referrals from other people, you've got to let those other people know. And when it comes to networking, one of the most important things firms can do is to create a formal mentoring program that's designed to ensure that everybody gets a mentor. With these different paths of getting into the firm, that is through college recruitment or through referrals, and moving up in the firm through mentorship, we see that all three of these kinds of expanding from the informal to the formal, from a select group being eligible to everybody being eligible, they all promote diversity in management jobs, not just in frontline jobs, because they keep people on board after they arrive. They all promote dramatic increases in diversity, much more dramatic than the typical thing that firms do, which is to put in diversity training programs, most of which don't do anything at all or backfire.
And again, what was amazing in your book is to look at that quantitative data. I mean, you were looking at organizations where you measured how things were before these ideas were put into place, and then you measured how they were after these ideas were put into place. And you were seeing really impressive numbers of these changes for an increase in diversity of managers. And again, you make that great case at the end of the book. By increasing the diversity of managers, you are changing who's at the table. You're changing the conversation of what the organization's purpose and mission and goals and objectives and how to accomplish them. And that is such a powerful way to make change. So it's just very exciting to read such concrete ideas that organizations can put into action, very achievable, and with good results. I thought one really fun, simple example was you were talking about the power of self-managed teams. And, you put these cross groups together to work on a project together. And you saw results where that wasn't necessarily the intent of putting that group together, but because you put a diverse group of people together working on a problem together, everybody got to see each other in action and go past the stereotypes that they were thinking perhaps, and see instead, hey, everybody in this team has been incredibly high functioning. I'm excited about this group. I want to help them. To me, that was just a simple, fun example of how organizations could be thinking differently around their DEI goals. Anything else you'd like to add about that?
Well, I think the key to self-managed teams is that they bring people from different occupations who are often occupations that are often pretty segregated. Like admin jobs tend to be mostly women. A lot of logistics jobs tend to be Black and Latinx men. Tech jobs tend to be white men, but you put those three groups together working on toward a common goal, like the rollout of a new product and how we get it to customers. And what you see is people show their skills across groups and they end up in management. People, especially women and men of color, end up in jobs that they might not have gotten otherwise. They also develop new kinds of skills working together with other people. What's interesting about, for example, self-managed teams, formal mentoring programs, and these referral incentive programs is they're not diversity programs. They are good management programs. If you look at Harvard Business Review, you can find articles about each of these things, talking about how they're great management principles. They also happen to have the effect of democratizing the workplace, democratizing the career system, and helping people, different kinds of people, move into better jobs or higher paid jobs. And what I think one of the reasons our book is getting some traction is that we have hard data from over 800 companies over 40 or 50 years. And so we can show across these companies with statistical magic what the actual effects on the managerial workforce are.
Yeah. Well, let's zero in on mentoring, because I think there's mentoring that's been done, but you're trying to talk about a different kind of mentoring. In other words, there's a way to do it that's more powerful, and there's a way to do it that kind of continues some of the problems of mentoring being more accessible to some people, not all people. So tell us a little bit more about what organizations could do to democratize mentoring.
Well, when mentoring programs started out in earnest in the 1980s, a lot of big companies put in mentoring programs after the realization that mentoring helps people develop the skills and networks they need to succeed. They initially started out with mentoring programs only for middle and upper managers. And a bunch of firms figured out that they needed to bring those down to lower level managers and even people in frontline jobs, because everybody's job performance could be improved by having a mentor. And people who would like to move up and have the capabilities to move up, but who aren't already in management, they can be discovered by higher level people. Unfortunately, I would say in the last 5 or 10 years, a lot of companies have moved away from offering mentoring broadly, and they've moved toward giving mentoring only to high performance or high potential. So what companies call their hypo workforces, which is kind of the top 5 or 3 or 1% of junior employees. These people are identified and then put into these special mentoring programs. But what it means is that the people I was speaking about a moment ago, the people who would like to move up and have the capability, but are just not already in management job, nobody has found them yet. Those people don't get offered mentors. And in our analyses, the kind of mentoring that works best is the kind that is offered to everybody in the firm. A good program should really reach down to the lowest level people in the firm, the frontline people who are recent employees, and try to figure out a way for them to get the sorts of mentoring that might help them to stay in the firm. And if they want to move into different positions, to find their way into the kinds of positions that they really would like to have.
And so a takeaway is, there's this way that you're encouraging organizations to think bigger and more inclusive in all of these different parts of the career system. And a great example of where that's, really done well, a simple example you gave is democratizing training. And so you gave, I think it was the example of, maybe it was one of the big stores, Walmart or someplace, that had everybody involved with training where they would learn basic budgeting and scheduling. And so it was this way to kind of, although it wasn't mentoring, it was, let's get some basic important information that if everybody's exposed to this, it'll help our business do better, but it also maybe will help us discover those people too. So being more broad and inclusive in who gets training is another way this could be approached.
Right. I mean, Walmart is one of many employers that have a large number of frontline workers. And they were one of the first to offer training very broadly in these training institutions they set up, where there's an incentive. If you're a cashier, if you're a frontline worker, there's an incentive for you to go through the formal training with a lot of skills that you might not have picked up that will help you to be a better employee. And it's improved retention. It's improved the promotion rates of Black frontline workers, which is one of their big goals. Another way that firms democratize training is to do cross-training cross departments. So especially this tends to be for people who are like management track, where they'll train people who come into HR. They'll also spend a month in finance. And, you know, the people who come into HR are predominantly Black women in many organizations. And so they'll get a stint in finance and be able to show their stuff if they're good at finance and figure out whether they would want to work there. So, and what we see these kinds of training programs are very effective in our analyses of what happens after firms put them in.
Great, great. And so what you see if you read Frank's book is that he's got this very concrete ideas of how all across the whole career system changes can be made. And he's got data to show that when these changes are made, you really have the results that you want. And he concludes by talking about how you need to kind of bake it into the system. For example, you know, having somebody in charge. If you want to have success around your DEI goals, you need somebody in charge. You need some measurable goals. You know, any other important takeaways that you think you've been learning about? There's so many more, but any others that you want to quickly say around what you've been learning around these issues?
Well, in terms of having somebody in charge, my colleague and co-author Sandra Caleb and I have been finding over the years that task forces, a diversity task force, is one of the best ways to put someone in charge, in part because you're bringing heads of departments from all across the organization, you're bringing them together, and they're brainstorming for ideas. They look at the data, try to figure out what's wrong. Why are we not promoting more Black women? Why are we not retaining more Latinx women? They'll come up with solutions and they'll take them back to their departments and put them into place. 6 months later, they're back at the table looking at the data again, trying to figure out if this worked, and if not, they'll come up with something else. So that's a way to, you know, build some responsibility, not only in the people in the DEI office, but build some responsibility in the people in line management, people who are heads of departments, for making the change and making sure the changes that they make actually do the things they had intended.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I'm going to tell you something funny, and then we're going to switch to talk to Beth, because your book is very rational. Here's the logical thing to do. And I feel like I started Third Path thinking, hey, I've got a logical idea. It's only going to take 7 years to get families and workplaces to do these ideas, because it makes so much sense. It's better for families. It's better for society, better for organizations. So I was like, hey, no problem. We'll get workplaces, families all changed in 7 years. What Beth's going to help us understand is that, well, there's the rational, and I'm not dismissing the rational because the rational is smart. And then there's this other stuff that seems to get in the way of change happening. So hold on. We're going to get Beth here to talk a little bit about that. Beth.
Hi.
You got to hear some logic around how organizations can make change. You got to hear how there's quantitative data that they're making change.
Oh, yeah.
And then there's the rest of the world.
So this is exciting. It's exciting for everybody on this call, actually, because Frank's work is, I mean, he's really quite well renowned in the field. And this was a wonderful opportunity. One of the first times I've ever had a chance to hear him talk about his work. And I took a bunch of notes. So I'm really excited
Yeah.
and honored and excited to be here.
Yeah. And what's interesting though, talking to you, and getting prepared for today's call, there is this other side. And I can even see it real time right now, because here we had the pandemic. 47% of employees started working remotely, fully remotely. And yet today, what I'm seeing is some retrenchment from this.
Oh yeah, I think we're down to like 27 or 28% now. I mean, like, it's much, much lower than where it was in the height of the pandemic.
And so something's going on just around flexibility, around, like we were able to do this. We proved it could be done, yet there is this going backwards. And to me, that speaks to something around your work, and that it's not just logical that we're moving forward. There's something else that gets in the way. And when I read those words about the importance of, I'm going to read them again, the importance of vulnerability, trust, empathy, risk-taking. This is what it said to me, Beth, honestly. That's what we've been doing at ThirdPath. We've been reaching out to people, and we've been creating space for people to be vulnerable, empathetic, risk-taking, to think about, hey, we don't have to do things the way they've always been done, but it's scary to try to do it differently. And so we've tried to create safe spaces for these kinds of conversations around, let's reach for something bigger and better. So it was very meaningful for me to read those words, because I see, as we try to make change, there's a logic, and then there's the relational, the human side, the something else. So tell us a little bit about what you've been learning, Beth.
One of the things that excuse me, my co-author Tina and I have been working together for a number of years around issues around gender and racial diversity in the workplace. And one of my alternative research areas is on work and family, how couples negotiate jobs, all of these sorts of issues that we talk about all the time that I live, right? They say the personal is political, the personal is also academic, right? Apparently. But what's interesting about that is we were really talking about, how do you get from this conversation that was happening in the summer of 2020? There were these sort of dual conversations that were happening, right? Which was, how do we change people's hearts and minds, right? What people think, what people believe, these prejudices that people have. A lot of the books that people were buying at that time were really about that. How do you figure out your blind spots? How do you get past these things? And then there was a whole, other conversation that was like, well, that's a distraction. Mm-hmm. What matters are our workplace policies, systemic changes, et cetera. And how do we do that? How do we hold people accountable? And I think Frank has a whole number of wonderful tips about how do we hold people in power in organizations accountable for these sorts of changes that need to be made, and how effective the data demonstrates, I think, very clearly how effective those sort of accountability measures can be. And what we were interested in is, well, how do you bridge those two things, right? I teach primarily human resources classes in our MBA program, intro to management classes with our undergraduates. And what I'm often saying is, I don't care what you think, and my job is to help you make good decisions, because your bad decisions can reflect poorly upon us as an organization, right? And so I'm not trying to change your hearts and minds. I'm trying to change your behaviors. But as we talked throughout that summer, what Tina and I talked about was, well, it sure does make it a whole lot easier to change your behaviors if your hearts and minds are also changed, right?
Yeah.
And when we are talking about making change in organizations, you're often not talking about one person at the top whose mind you have to change. It's often not one person who has full control over the policies and procedures in the organization. That if we could just get in that person's head, if we could just hold that person accountable, the culture would change. Often there are just networks of people who have control over different types of policies, who have input on different policies and procedures. There can be managers at many different levels in the organization who have control over those things. And what that means is that the influence that you have upon them is truly, and what our argument is relational in a lot of ways. And so what we do with Shared Sisterhood is really think about, how do you get from that, what we call dig work, that how do you dig into your own preconceptions? How do you do that individual work And then how do you get to systemic change in organizations? Through these relationships you build. And we talk about that the relationships that you build with people at work when you want to make this sort of change should be characterized by making yourself vulnerable, right? Or being able to feel that you can be vulnerable with somebody else. Trust. So those interactions should be building trust or facilitating trust or demonstrating trustworthiness. You do that by, building your empathy skills and by demonstrating empathy, particularly across power-related differences. And often that requires, particularly those of us who enter into these sort of dyadic or one-on-one relationships with more power, you demonstrate that by taking risks, right? In particular ways, by demonstrating I'm trustworthy. I am making myself vulnerable by putting myself at risk in these sorts of ways. And I think whether it's we talk about mentoring, whether we talk about training, whatever these sorts of, I think, systems within organizations we talk about, they are run, maintained, created by people, right? And they are maintained and run and created and continue to be created by the relationships that people have. And that's what we really wanted to dig down into and really focus on that relational, what we call the bridge building that occurs between people.
It was so exciting to read about, because I think it is exactly that. There is this logical, if we just stick with flexibility, there's this logical truth that I think most organizations really would benefit from becoming what I call a high-performing hybrid workplace. There's a lot of low-performing hybrid workplaces, and I think there's some things that need to happen to make them high-performing hybrid workplaces. And what you're saying is those relationships with those people who are part of the decision-making process are going to be key to helping bridge those conversations that need to happen to keep that momentum going forward, not backwards. It's the relationships with key people that will make that momentum continue moving forward as opposed to slipping backwards. And we're seeing that too, Beth. I mean, it's really interesting how much that is a core ingredient. So you have this logic that needs to happen, and you have this relational that is just as important for progress to happen. There might be something else you want to say.
No, I was just gonna. You make a really good point. I mentioned that one of my other research areas in work and family, which is why we had this, I think, wonderful conversation about this overlap between the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion and flexibility, for instance, at work. And I have a large grant that I'm a PI on from the CDC that's been looking at remote management training, and we've developed this training. And one of the things that we've been doing as we've been rolling this out and testing and gathering data to test its efficacy is I have these conversations with managers, and I've been doing this within my own organization here at the University of Iowa and all these Iowa organizations, right, in the state. And I am often getting in the room with execs, right, upper division leaders. And Frank said something, I think, which was so true and so important to this relational point, which is a lot of those folks forget what it felt like to not have that sort of control over their schedule, right? If they have something come up, their admin changes the meeting, right? Like they can navigate that. They can work from a hotel room when they're traveling. They can move. They can do those sorts of things. And they don't necessarily remember what it's like to have to ask permission. Okay. And it is indeed that sort of autonomy that I often see. I mean, those of us who do research in this area, know the critical importance of the construct of autonomy, feeling like you have control over things. And that is what I think underpins diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, right? And these relational components and how successful they are, but also these sorts of issues of flexibility is how can people feel when people feel like they have control over their careers? What happens there? What's the dynamic? You feel like your boss trusts you, right? So let's say this. We've been working, in this hybrid way, in this remote way. And all of a sudden everybody's like, good job, everybody. But now we are going to start coming back into the office this many days a week. The message there is not, okay, good job, everybody. Now let's try something new. The message that many employees are receiving is, oh, you don't trust me. Right? You don't trust me. So it's not just the feeling of autonomy, which we know as an individual thing matters for job satisfaction, turnover, the way people do their jobs, but it's the relationship between the manager and the employees begins to degrade because there's a lack of trust there. You don't trust me to do my job well. You don't trust that I'm doing my job. You think that you need to monitor me to make sure I'm doing my job. And it's that emotion that I think is driving so much of this.
Oh my gosh, you just said it so well. Well, let's add Frank back in to expand this conversation a little bit. And it's only going to be a couple minutes because the time is marching on. So we've been thinking a little bit about how what you're proposing, Frank, is so smart and logical. And then there's this human side, this relational side that can get messy and take us off course. Anything you want to add to the conversation? Then I have an example I want to give that might you might both want to reflect on. Any thoughts, Frank, when you listen in?
Well, I thought what Beth just said was right on the money. It's exactly where we are now. I mean, I have to say, in my world, that is sociologists who study work life and diversity programs, everybody thought that when we went back to work, it would look like much more like it was looking during COVID, where people would be their own masters, where if you could get your work done, and you had proven during COVID you were able to get your work done from home, you'd have the flexibility to do what you needed in your home life, what you needed to do at work. And I think it's so surprising that organizations haven't done that. Many organizations, I mean, I'm not surprised by the statistic Beth threw out. 20%, 27% are now working remotely. Most organizations could go back to what they had during COVID, and it's interesting to see their arguments for why they can't. So they're not logical arguments. They're not, we proved that this didn't work because they proved that it did work. They are emotional arguments. They're arguments that I don't believe that my industry can operate remotely, or
fear. There's a lot of fear. I don't know how to manage. I'm insecure.
And that's exactly where I was going. I don't know how to manage people I can't see. I need to see them doing their jobs. And the fact is, a lot of people don't need that much oversight. I mean, they don't need that much management. That's what we saw during COVID. And during COVID, you could tell if people weren't doing their work. I mean, if you're just looking at them in their cubicle, you can't really tell, right? But you noticed that they weren't doing their work. So I feel like we need to bring awareness of that, of the emotional decision to send people back to work. And we need to try to get people to be in touch with their own emotions and try to understand, why am I doing this? Do I need to do this? What's going on in here that I feel that I need the people to be back all the time?
Amen. That's what I was really excited about having us capture today, because I think that's what's been so surprising is, and again, there is the logic that's just as important, and the data. If their goals are a more inclusive organization, your book shows them, here's what you need to do. And there is the relational and the feelings and the irrational that we also need to find ways to have that, take a risk, have that conversation with that person who seems to be retreating in their thinking, and say, hey, what's going on? How can we help you think bigger here? And those individual relational conversations, I think, are going to be critical at this moment in time. And as you said, Beth, it's not just one person. There's going to be a few different people who are moving the train in one direction or the other. And how do we capture all those people? I want to have one more person join us in a few minutes. One of the goals this year is to try to give you a 5-minute insight into how can you take what you're hearing today and think about how to make some changes for yourself. But before we go to that person, there might be something, Beth, you want to add to the conversation, or Frank. Beth, I'll start with you. Anything you want to add to the conversation?
The only thing that I would say is just, doubling down on Frank's last point there about the way that these feelings are getting involved in, that was one of the premises behind the grant that we were granted, right? They gave us a lot of money to say, this is a big issue, because there are a lot of people who, when some data that we collected during the pandemic demonstrated that people who were able to work from home for the first time felt more productive and less stressed. But their managers, their immediate frontline supervisors, felt more stressed because they did not know how to manage in this way. Because a lot of times these first-time managers, if you've never managed before, you're not trained to do it. You're promoted because you were good in your one role, but you're not necessarily trained to manage in this next role, right? And it's that first leap there's a lot of anxiety and there's a lot of leaky pipeline that happens as you continue to go on. And really focusing on empowering those people to know how to manage meetings, to know how to check in, not check up, right? To know how to really not micromanage. I know that's such a buzzword, but we really feel there's a lot of value add there that could decrease the temperature and this panic that I think happens with, I can't see you. If I can't monitor you, I don't know that you're working. And I think that there's an underpinning there that I think really factors into DEI work as well, which is I'm scared to do this. I don't know how to do this. I don't think I have the skills or ability, and stretching beyond that feels too hard for me. And I think that we have to tap into what those emotions are and respect them if we want to try to make change.
Wow. Anything you want to add, Frank, or should we leave it there?
I mean, that's a very good note to end on.
Okay, good. I am going to ask Beth and Frank for one more wise word at the very end. But really now what I'd like to do is turn to one more person to help us think a little bit about, okay, we've been thinking about some big ideas here about how we need to make some changes in society and changes in organizations. But what if you want to make a change right now? And that's why we're doing these 5-minute moments. And we have Christopher Veal here today. I'm so glad you're here. Christopher Veal is the author of The Whole Man. He's a podcast host. He's an executive coach. He's also a parent of a high schooler and a great parent. I've been hearing some wonderful stories from Christopher. And so I am really pleased to have Christopher here today because he's an example of someone who's really busted through a number of myths, both as a parent and as a worker. And these are myths that often keep us very trapped. Christopher's story is also a warning to workplaces because people are ready for change and they want that change to happen. And Christopher said, you know what? I can leave and start my own business. I don't have to work here. And that is something that workplaces need to wake up and listen to today. And so he's also somebody who's really changing stereotypes on the personal level. He is a single dad. He's a Black father. And so you'll see in his story that he's just busting through a bunch of myths. And if that's not enough, in his Whole Man book, he talks about the importance of vulnerability, trust, empathy, and risk-taking. So this guy has been living this stuff. When you listened in today, Christopher, we want to hear a little bit about, how can we help people think about making changes themselves today? What helped you have the courage to make some changes? Why has it been meaningful for you to go ahead and make some changes?
Yes. Well, first of all, again, Jessica, thank you. I really have to say it was a gift to get to be a fly on the wall during this conversation. And as I was listening to both Frank and Beth talk, there were really two key things I think that stood out that I want to really capture here in this. And it was the themes of flexibility and vulnerability. No surprise with vulnerability. But I want to start with flexibility. And for me, I appreciate that Frank was talking about the idea that often senior leaders feel they have the permission and the ability to do it, but people that are maybe, lower in the ranks might not. And I know that was especially true for me. Early on in my career, when I got out of the Marine Corps and was starting to work in corporate America, I didn't often see that I could have that flexibility, which was important to me because I was a new father. I had a young child. I was fortunate, though, that I had some leaders that I worked for that really advocated for creating inclusive spaces. And they also modeled flexibility. They were leaders that would take time off to take care of family and do other things. And so what I really appreciated from it was not only did I hear the leaders saying it, but I got to see them doing it. And so their actions were in alignment with their words, which had me feel safer to say, okay, you know what? I need that time. In 2014, my mother was diagnosed with cancer, and I needed to take time off between being a husband and a father and also being a caregiver for my mother and juggling all these things. And I had a boss who was really supportive of me in that. And it was powerful because it had me realize, okay, that's something that I deserve and I can ask for. Where it continued to impact me is that when I became a leader in organizational development work, which that I did, I also got to model that and advocate for it for my people. And so when I would look at opportunities or jobs that I was going to be considering, one of the questions I would ask them often is, how do they support flexibility for their people. And this is back before we had the pandemic come along. And if the responses I would get from those organizations were anything less than what felt like they were supportive, I would pass on them. And it meant times that I passed on opportunities for a higher salary or a bigger or better title, because what I knew is that was important to me. And money is money, great. And I had enough to make sure I was paying my bills. But if I didn't feel like I would have the flexibility where sometimes my daughter might get sick and I might need to leave work early, or I have something coming up, can I have some flexible time? And so the organizations that really supported that were the ones that attracted my attention and attracted the attention of a lot of my colleagues and peers. It was also something that I made sure that I reinforced for my teams when I was leading them. And so for me, what it came down to is I started to create this idea of, ultimately, I want to give you autonomy to do what you need to do, and ultimately still understand what we need to accomplish as a team. And I trusted that as long as they were doing what we needed to be doing, great, take what you need to. One of the things that I really loved about that is it helped them feel more engaged in the work that they were doing. And as I saw other leaders start to adopt similar behaviors, it started to create a culture of people feeling supported, and less of that, as we talk about sometimes, micromanaging, or that there's someone always looking over your shoulder. I love the piece that was just brought into, and just because someone's sitting in a cubicle there does not mean they're being productive. And so if you're trusting your people, they are going to produce results for you. The other big thing that stood out for me was vulnerability. Again, no surprise. But I particularly like that Beth talked about change requires vulnerability. And some of the most impactful leaders that I've either worked for or worked alongside have been the ones that bring greater levels of vulnerability. And I also say appropriate vulnerability. Don't bring your deepest, darkest secrets to work. That might not be what's needed. But the willingness to open up and share a little bit more about yourself than you think you typically have to in a professional setting. Well, the impact it created was that people related to their humanity, and it ultimately resulted in greater trust and connection. As organizations are navigating this post-pandemic world, and they're working through issues like remote work versus return to office, what I know is that the willingness for leaders to lean into vulnerability and be willing to create those inclusive workspaces, that's what's going to separate the average organizations from the ones that thrive. And the ones that create those inclusive spaces are going to be the ones that win the battle for talent. They're going to attract and retain that quality talent that's needed going forward. I think the last thing that I want to say about this is that it requires a great level of vulnerability from the leaders to be able to lean into giving their people autonomy. So if anyone's ever read the book Drive from Dan Pink, he talks about autonomy. And I think it's a great, I refer it to a lot of my clients nowadays and say, there's some good learning in there. But what it really means is that we are navigating this new landscape. And a lot of leaders, as was just said, don't know how to lead. How do I manage this when the entire example I had when I was coming through my, leaders might say coming up through their ranks, was leaders being there in person. And so they don't have a new dynamic or a new reference to look at. So part of what we need to do is we need to be patient and support leaders as they're trying to navigate this, but also remind them that it's important to trust in their people. There's been lots of studies done showing that people were as productive, if not more productive, and more satisfied and engaged when they were able to work remotely or had the flexibility. So if we know it works, we need to help them figure out how do we step past that fear response that both Frank and Beth were just talking about, so that they can take that breath and go, okay, wait a minute. I know that's that fear happening and I know it works. So how do I come in alignment with my people so that we can figure out how do we best work and move forward? So I think those are the big takeaways that I took, and I'm excited to learn more about what you're doing here. And thank you for letting me be a part of this conversation today.
Oh, wonderful advice around how you've made some changes, how people can make some changes right now, and why it's so possible today to go ahead and do some of these ideas. Thank you so much, Christopher.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to put up a couple more slides, and then we're going to get our wrap-up thoughts from Frank and Beth. Oh my goodness, I knew this was going to be an exciting conversation, and it's been exactly what I was hoping for. So wow, this time has flown as usual. And we want to make sure that, if you want to learn more, you can go to our website. We've got lots and lots of free resources available for you. And a week from now, we will have today's event recorded and available as well. And if you want to continue the conversation, you can join our Trailblazers Facebook group, or you can follow us on social media. And you should come back next month for our next Thursdays with ThirdPath live podcast. And as you can see, we really have, as a nonprofit, been successful to build a community of role models and change agents. Help us expand our work and support our free resources by making a donation through our website today. Wow, time flies when we have such smart, thoughtful, pioneering people out there doing important work. Really, thank you for the excellent work you guys are both doing and for being part of today's event. I really appreciate it. Frank, any last words of wisdom for people who are listening in today? Something that they can take home?
You know, one of the things that we see organizations do that's so effective is to get managers who are day-to-day dealing with employees and their struggles to make things work, especially in the realm of work family, is to get them to try to think about what the organization could be doing differently and to not hold back. That is, to not hold back in proposing something that's radically different. Because often those managers who are dealing with frontline employees, they're the ones who see where the problems really are. And if they feel they have the flexibility themselves to come up with new strategies, often they're the people who see where the problem is and how it could be fixed.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, there's definitely been a theme around helping those frontline managers get more skilled, and as you're saying, get some more voice to help problem solve around this too. I think that the managers, one of the reasons why I'm excited about ThirdPath's work is we do a lot of work to support managers. It's hard to be a manager and be a role model. And so, you know, giving them some support around and knowledge around how to be this integrated manager is really something I'm very proud that ThirdPath does. Great advice, Frank. Beth, you got the last word. Any last advice?
You know, I would say this: when you are building relationships at work, right? Engage in those relationships in authentic ways. And I think to Christopher's point, that doesn't mean you go in saying, I'm going to tell you my whole life story. Now, don't you want to listen to me? But it means in those interactions, really learn the skills of listening. Think about how you can empathize with the person. And something that I always say, a skill that I try to engage in with the people I manage, with the people I consult with my students, is I try to engage in something called generous intent, which is when I'm engaging with you, it's the most generous way I can interpret what we're going through right here. And I think it's a great managerial skill that can help us to think about requests for autonomy, requests for flexibility. It can help us to think about those bold ideas that Frank was talking about, how we can encourage those bold big ideas. If we can engage in those, assuming the most generous intent in the people that we're working with, then we can engage in really good faith with those ideas that are coming out. And there are so many creative and bold ideas that come out. If you can look at the creativity and entrepreneurship and innovation that's happening around this country in small and large organizations, and I would just love to see that same energy being put towards these problems of flexibility, autonomy, and diversity, equity, and inclusion at work. Let's see those same bold solutions coming in here.
Wonderful, wonderful. And what you've really taught us today too, Beth, is that this relational activity is an essential part of work. And so let's not call it just doing relational stuff. This is actually really what we're saying today, is if we really want to get to those bold, big ideas and take us to the next place, this relational work is integral to our ability to capture these ideas and make these new ideas happen well. Hey, thank you. Keep on doing the amazing work you're doing. Thanks so much for a really great,
yes, thank you
great
so much.
conversation.